The candlelight trembled against the gilt mirrors of Whitmore Hall, its glow making the faces in the drawing-room look like ghosts rather than guests. The scent of rosewater and brandy mingled uneasily in the air. At the centre of it all stood Lady Alara Whitmore, her slender fingers pressed against the cold rim of a champagne glass she had no desire to drink from. She was 22, too young to feel as though her life were already over. Yet tonight her fate was being sealed in silk and signatures. Her uncle, Lord Brant, raised his glass in a toast that made Ilara's stomach twist. "To the union that will restore the Whitmore name," he declared, "and to the man gracious enough to accept our dear Ilara's hand, the Earl of Doncaster." The room broke into polite applause. Ilara lifted her eyes to meet those of the man she was being bartered to, and for the first time that night she wished she could vanish into the dark between the chandeliers. Lord Cedric Doncaster was not old, not decrepit, but his cruelty had already carved deep lines around his mouth. His gaze slid over her like a collector inspecting a painting, not a man beholding a bride. The scar near his temple, earned in some forgotten duel, caught the light like a serpent's scale. He smiled faintly, and it was not a pleasant thing. "You have your mother's eyes," he murmured when he approached her, the smell of tobacco clinging to his coat. "Though I expect you'll learn better manners than she ever had." Her pulse stumbled. "My lord?" He only chuckled, setting his glass aside. "You'll learn to speak when spoken to. I like obedience, not chatter." The laughter that followed from nearby gentlemen was casual, cruel, the kind that travelled like smoke through the air. Ilara curtsied mechanically, her heart hammering. She felt her mother's ghost in that moment, the woman who had died defending her right to love freely, the woman Ilara had promised herself she'd never forget. But promises mean little when poverty has a voice. Her uncle's debts had buried them long before she ever wore her first gown. The Earl's offer had come like salvation wrapped in venom. "One marriage," Lord Brant had said, "and the Whitmore fortune will breathe again." Ilara had tried to reason, to plead, but every door in her life had already been closed. And so tonight she stood in the hall of her ancestors, her wrists bound in invisible chains, her voice muted by duty. She excused herself early, retreating to the balcony overlooking the frozen gardens. The moon hung low, pale as her reflection in the glass. She gripped the railing, her breath misting in the air. "Is this to be my life?" she whispered. "A name, a ring, and silence." The wind answered with a low moan through the hedges. Behind her, the ballroom door opened. Doncaster's voice slid through the cold. "There you are, my little dove. You shouldn't wander off. I've many expectations. For my future wife, and one of them is obedience." Ilara turned, every muscle in her body taut. "And what of affection, my lord? Does that find a place in your expectations?" He smirked. "Affection is earned, and you've not yet proven deserving." He reached out, brushing his gloved hand against her chin. The touch burned, not from warmth, but from something darker. When she pulled back, his smile faltered. "Defiance? How charming. We'll break that soon enough." He left her standing there, trembling in the cold. When the door shut behind him, the laughter and music rose again, hollow and heartless. That night, when her maid helped her undress for bed, Ilara sat before the mirror and looked at herself. The pale silk gown, the diamond pendant at her throat, the eyes rimmed with unshed tears. Somewhere deep inside, a decision began to take root. In the distance, church bells tolled midnight. By dawn, she would not be Lady Doncaster. She would be a fugitive of her own destiny. The The first light of morning had not yet touched the horizon when Lady Ilara Whitmore opened her chamber door and stepped into the silent corridors of Whitmore Hall. The air was cold and heavy, thick with the scent of extinguished candles and wilted roses left from last night's celebration. Her heart pounded so violently she feared it might give her away. She was still in her nightgown, though she had thrown a dark wool cloak over it. Beneath her arm she clutched a small satchel, all she could carry of her former life. Inside were her mother's locket, a change of linen, and a sealed letter addressed to her younger brother Thomas, who lived far away at school. The letter said only, "Forgive me. I will find freedom, or I will find peace." Her bare feet whispered across the marble floor as she moved past the portraits of her ancestors. The eyes in the paintings seemed to follow her, cold and unblinking, as though they too disapproved of her rebellion. When she reached the grand staircase, she froze. Below, by the doors, stood two of Doncaster's men, broad-shouldered, half asleep, but armed. She held her breath, listening to their murmured conversation. "Earl's orders," one said. "No one leaves the house before sunrise. He's to have the girl in the chapel by morning." Her stomach turned. They meant her. Summoning every ounce of courage, she slipped toward the servants' stairwell instead. The narrow passage smelled of coal and damp linen. Her candle flickered, throwing trembling shadows along the stone. She thought of her mother's voice, gentle, firm, always singing softly when fear came close. "Courage, my little one. Even the smallest flame can survive the storm." By the time Ilara reached the kitchen, dawn was still a faint silver promise on the horizon. The scullery maid, Nora, startled when she saw her. "My lady, what are you doing?" "I'm leaving, Nora," Ilara whispered. "I cannot marry that man. Please, say nothing." The girl's eyes widened, but she nodded. "God go with you." Ilara slipped through the back door, pulling the hood over her head. The moment the cold air hit her face, her lungs filled with freedom. Sharp, painful, real. The moors stretched before her like a sea of fog and frost. Each step she took away from the hall was a step out of the life she'd been trapped in. Behind her, the church bells began to toll, the sound of her wedding day. She did not look back. The wind bit at her cheeks as she crossed the heather fields, her shoes soaked through. Once or twice she thought she heard horses in the distance, Doncaster's men, no doubt, realizing their prize had fled. Her breath came in ragged bursts. She stumbled, caught herself, pressed on. When the sun broke the horizon, it did so like a blade through cloud, blood-red and merciless. She reached the edge of the woodlands bordering Ravenfell, a neighbouring estate rumoured to belong to a madman, Duke Damien Hawthorne, the war hero turned recluse. The villagers called him cursed. Some said he had killed his wife, others whispered that his scar was punishment from God himself. Ilara did not care. Madness was safer than marriage. She pressed deeper into the trees. Branches clawed at her cloak, the forest closing around her like a secret. Her lungs burned. Every sound, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, sent her heart leaping. Hours passed. The fog thickened until she could barely see. Her strength waned. Hunger gnawed at her belly. When she reached a clearing near the cliffs, the ground slick with frost, her knees buckled. The satchel slipped from her grasp and fell into the grass. For a moment, she thought of turning back, of surrendering to fate. But then she saw it, the faint outline of a manor in the distance, dark and towering against the sea. Ravenfell Keep. "Just a little farther," she whispered, dragging herself forward. A distant sound of hooves echoed behind her. Duncaster's men were close now. She pushed herself upright, stumbling toward the cliffs. Her vision blurred. The world tilted. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was a figure on horseback emerging through the mist. Tall, imposing, black cloak billowing like wings. Then the world went still. The Duke of Ravenfell had found her. The storm that morning came not from the heavens but from the sea. It rolled across the cliffs in sheets of rain and ghostly fog, swallowing the world in grey. Duke Damien Hawthorne rode along the edge of Ravenfell's moors, his horse's hooves thudding against the sodden earth, his cloak snapping like a wounded banner behind him. He had risen early, as he always did, to escape the walls that whispered too loudly of the past. The keep behind him was little more than a shadow of its former glory. Stone blackened by soot, windows shuttered against light, corridors lined with dust and silence. He preferred the company of storms. They did not ask questions, but as he neared the cliffs, something broke the rhythm of rain and wind, a figure, small and still, lying crumpled among the wet heather. He pulled the reins sharply, heart pounding despite himself. At first, he thought it a trick of mist, perhaps a fallen bird or discarded garment, but then he saw the faint rise and fall of breath. A woman. He dismounted in one fluid motion, boots sinking into the mud. Her cloak was soaked through, her hair tangled across her face, streaked with frost. When he knelt beside her and brushed the strands aside, he froze. She was young, too young to be wandering these moors alone, and beautiful in the pale, fragile way of porcelain that's been left too long in the cold. For a long moment, he simply stared. He hadn't looked at a woman this closely in years, not since the fire. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath his fingers. Alive, he muttered, almost disbelieving. He glanced toward the horizon. No carriage, no riders, no sign of life. Only the endless moor and the sea crashing far below. Whoever she was, she had come here running from something. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror too many times. "Foolish girl," he murmured, scooping her into his arms. "Whatever devils drove you here, they nearly finished their work." His horse shifted uneasily as he lifted her, but Damien's strength did not waver. She weighed little more than a memory. He mounted, holding her close as he turned back toward the keep. By the time they reached Ravenfell, the servants were awake, their faces pale with curiosity, as the Duke strode through the front doors, a half-frozen woman in his arms. "Fetch hot water," he ordered, his voice echoing through the stone halls. "And blankets, now." The butler, Mr. Gorse, hesitated. "Your Grace." "A woman?" Damien's glare silenced him. "A human being. Move." They obeyed, vanishing down the corridors. He carried her to the east wing, a place untouched for years. The fire there had long since gone out, but he set her down upon the bed and lit the hearth himself. His hands, though scarred, worked deftly. When he turned back, she stirred. Her lashes fluttered. Her lips parted with a faint sound. "Where?" "You're safe," he said curtly. "At Ravenfell." Her eyes opened fully then. Deep green, luminous even in the dim firelight. She stared at him as though trying to decide whether he was salvation or doom. "The Duke," she whispered, recognizing him from the stories that reached every corner of England. "They say you—" "Don't repeat what they say," he interrupted, his voice edged with steel. "You'll find this house has no patience for gossip." She swallowed, trembling. "Forgive me, I didn't mean—" He sighed, turning away. "You'll rest. Then you'll leave." "Leave?" she echoed weakly. "But I have nowhere—" "That is not my concern." His tone was cold, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Whatever trouble sent you into the storm, it won't follow you here. Stay one night." "No longer." She sank back into the pillow, too weak to argue. The warmth of the fire crept slowly into her bones. "What should I call you, sir?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "Nothing. Sleep." And then, with a faint, bitter smile, "No one calls me anything any more." She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under. The Duke stood there a moment longer, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. A long-forgotten feeling, protectiveness perhaps, stirred in him, unwelcome but undeniable. He turned sharply and left, his boots echoing down the corridor. But later that night, when the storm had passed and the manor was silent again, Damien Hawthorne found himself standing in the doorway once more, watching the stranger he had rescued sleep beneath the flicker of dying embers. He told himself it was caution that brought him there, a need to ensure she still breathed. But when she murmured in her sleep and his heart answered with a strange, quiet ache, he knew the truth. The house that had forgotten warmth was beginning to feel it again. Morning came shrouded in fog, the kind that clung to the windows of Ravenfell Keep like breath upon glass. The manor had always been a place of silence, its halls echoing with memories rather than voices, but today that silence was different, thinner, uncertain, as though the house itself held its breath. When Lady Elara Whitmore awoke, her first thought was that she might have died. The room around her was unfamiliar, vast and cold, its canopy bed hung with faded velvet. A single fire still smouldered in the hearth, filling the air with the faint scent of smoke and sea salt. Then memory returned. The flight, the rain, the fall, the man in the mist, the Duke. She sat up too quickly and winced as the room swayed. Her gown was gone, replaced by a plain linen shift. A folded cloak rested nearby, freshly dried. On the chair beside the bed lay a tray with bread, broth and tea, untouched but still warm. Someone had been here recently. "Good," a deep voice said from the doorway. "You're awake." She startled, turning. Duke Damien Hawthorne stood there, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His clothes were simple but immaculately tailored. Black waistcoat, white shirt, gloves of dark leather. His expression, however, was unreadable. "I owe you my life, Your Grace," Elara said softly, her voice rough from sleep. "You found me." "I found a stranger trespassing on my land," he corrected. "Had I known you would bring half the countryside's gossip with you, I might have left you to the moor." Elara's cheeks flushed. "I meant no intrusion, sir. I sought only shelter." He regarded her in silence for a moment, then sighed. "You'll have it for one more night. After that you'll leave," Letiba hesitated. "You wish me gone so soon?" "This house," he said quietly, stepping into the room, "does not take kindly to guests, nor do I." His tone was sharp, but his eyes betrayed something else, weariness or perhaps grief too long contained. Elara noticed the scar along his jaw again, a pale reminder of some past pain. "Forgive me," she murmured. "I'll trouble you no longer than necessary." He nodded once and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Your clothes are drying in the servants' quarters. You may walk the west corridors if you wish, but do not go beyond the chapel wing." "Why not?" His gaze darkened. "Because some doors are better left closed." When he was gone, Elara rose shakily and went to the window. Below, the garden stretched wild and overgrown, the fountain cracked, the roses choked by vines. It was a ruin, beautiful and heartbroken. She thought of the housekeeper's warning back at Whitmore, that Ravenfell was cursed, and found herself wondering what sorrow had rooted itself so deeply here. Later, a maid arrived, a small, nervous girl named Clara, carrying fresh garments and a basin of water. "The Duke doesn't often bring home strays," Clara whispered shyly as she helped Ilara dress. "Last time someone new came, it was the doctor, and that was years ago." "The doctor?" "For the Duchess," the girl said, then bit her lip. "Forgive me, my lady. I shouldn't speak of it." "The Duchess?" Ilara pressed gently. Clara lowered her eyes. "She died in the fire. The East Chapel burned 6 years ago this winter. His Grace hasn't opened it since." Ilara felt a chill pass through her. "And no one else lives here?" "Only those who serve. But it's not us he fears. It's the memories." When the girl left, Ilara wandered the corridor alone, guided by curiosity and the soft pull of pity she could not yet explain. The manor was vast, every corner filled with relics of a happier time. She paused before a grand portrait in the gallery, a woman in white silk, her beauty luminous even beneath the cracked varnish. A small brass plate read, "Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, the Duchess." Her painted smile seemed frozen mid-laughter, her eyes following Ilara with lifelike sorrow. Beneath the frame, a faint scorch mark licked the edge of the wall, fire's old fingerprint. That evening, unable to sleep, Ilara descended to the drawing-room. She found it cloaked in shadows lit only by the faint glow of embers. A forgotten piano stood in the corner, its lid gathering dust. She hesitated, then sat and pressed one key. The note rang soft and lonely through the hall. She began to hum, the same melody she had sung on the road, a lullaby her mother once whispered when storms came too near. The tune drifted upward through the house, fragile as candlelight. In the corridor above, Damien froze mid-step. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The sound of music, here, after all these years, cut through him like a blade and a balm both. His late wife had died with that very melody on her lips. He had forbidden music since. And yet, this voice was different, softer, human, alive. He stood there in the half-light, hand trembling at his side. Then, for the first time in years, he did not order silence. He simply listened. The days that followed passed in a kind of fragile truce between warmth and distance. Lady Ilara Whitmore, still recovering her strength, kept mostly to the west corridors as the Duke had commanded. She learned to move quietly, as though not to disturb the house itself. The servants watched her with cautious fascination, a ghost of gentleness moving through rooms that had long forgotten laughter. She took to reading in the library during the afternoons, wrapped in a shawl near the fire. The air smelled of dust and ink, and sometimes, when the wind rose outside, she imagined she could hear the ocean breathing beyond the cliffs. The Duke, meanwhile, appeared rarely. When he did, it was always unexpected, at the turn of a corridor, the edge of the garden, or the shadowed threshold of the library. Their conversations were brief, civil, and full of pauses. He would ask after her health, she would thank him for his hospitality. But beneath every word hung something unsaid, a tension that neither dared name. One morning, Ilara ventured beyond the permitted halls and found herself in what remained of the garden courtyard. Frost still rimmed the fountain, but the first buds of spring dared to bloom beneath it. She knelt to touch a half-open rose and smiled faintly. Even here, life persisted. "You shouldn't be here." The voice came from behind her, low and rough as thunder over water. She turned to see the Duke, standing at the archway, his coat dark against the pale stone. "I'm sorry," she said, straightening quickly. "I didn't mean to disobey." His eyes softened briefly before hardening again. You'll find I value obedience more than apologies." "Then you'll find I'm poor at both," she replied before she could stop herself. For a heartbeat, he simply stared. Then, impossibly, a small, unwilling smile ghosted across his lips. "So I've noticed." He stepped forward, his boots crunching over the frost. "This garden once belonged to my wife," he said quietly. "She tended every rose here herself. After the fire, I forbade anyone to touch it again." Ilara glanced around at the overgrown vines. "Then she would be very disappointed." He looked at her sharply. "Disappointed?" "That you let what she loved die with her." For a moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the bare branches. Then he said softly, "You speak as though you understand loss." "I do," she answered simply. "My mother, my father, my freedom, each taken in its turn. I know what it means to live among ghosts." He studied her face as though trying to read the truth there. "And what would you have me do, Lady Whitmore? Pretend the past never burned?" "No," she said gently. "But stop feeding the ashes." Something in him faltered. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the sea glimmered faintly through the fog. "You speak boldly for someone in exile." "Perhaps exile gives me courage," she murmured. "There's little left to lose." They stood in silence after that, the distance between them filled not with hostility but something quieter, the fragile warmth of shared solitude. When he finally turned to leave, he said, "You may walk here if you wish. Just be careful of the thorns." She smiled faintly. "Some things are worth a few scratches." That night, the house seemed less hollow. The fire burned brighter in the hearths the servants moved with lighter steps, and in the hall above the library, Damien paused before the door and listened to the faint hum of her voice drifting from within. He found himself remembering the rhythm of laughter, the comfort of a voice not born of memory but of life. It frightened him how easily she slipped through the walls he'd built around his grief. The next morning, he rode out early but found his thoughts lingering on her face. The way her eyes had met his without fear, the way her words carried both defiance and grace. By the time he returned, she was in the courtyard again, humming as she tended the roses. The sound wove through the air like sunlight through glass. He dismounted and watched from the archway, unseen. For years he had lived convinced that warmth invited ruin. That love, once lost, must never be risked again. But watching her now, the wind in her hair, the life in her hands, he wondered for the first time if perhaps he had been wrong. The peace that had begun to settle over Ravenfell. Keep was as fragile as the petals Ilara tended each morning in the garden. The servants had grown used to hearing her voice, soft as sunlight through fog threading through the halls. Even the Duke seemed less like a shadow and more like a man relearning his own heartbeat. But peace is a jealous thing. It invites envy, and it rouses the past. The first sign of intrusion came one grey afternoon when a letter arrived, its seal dark red and cruelly familiar. The butler delivered it to the Duke in his study, his eyes uneasy. Damien broke the wax and read in silence. When he finished, his hand tightened until the paper tore between his fingers. He said nothing at first. But when Ilara entered later with a tray of tea, a small courtesy she'd taken upon herself, he stood by the fire, his back to her, and the letter smouldering in the grate. "You've been found," he said finally, his voice low. Her hands stilled. "Found?" "The Earl of Doncaster knows you're here. He claims you were stolen from him. He's coming to reclaim his bride." Her breath caught. "I am not his bride. You are in his eyes, and in the eyes of the law. She set the tray down with trembling fingers. Then what will you do? I will not hand you over, he said, turning to face her. The firelight caught the scar on his jaw. But understand this, men like Doncaster don't accept defiance. He'll come with proof, with soldiers, with words sharp enough to wound reputations beyond repair. Let him, she whispered. I'd rather live ruined than owned. Something flickered in his eyes, admiration perhaps, or fear. You are braver than sense would advise, he said softly. And you, she countered, are kinder than you pretend. The silence between them was heavy but not cold. When he stepped closer, the space seemed to hum with things unspoken. For a heartbeat, she thought he might touch her hand. But instead he said, Go inside, Ilara. Lock your door. Should he arrive, I will deal with him. She wanted to argue, but the tension in his voice told her not to. So she nodded and left, though her heart did not calm. That night, thunder rolled in from the sea, and with it, horsemen. Ravenfell's great gates shuddered under the knock of mailed fists. The butler, pale, came running to the Duke's chamber. He's here, your grace, the Earl himself, and men with muskets. Let them in, Damien said, but tell them they'll be met by no frightened bride. When Doncaster entered the hall, rain gleamed on his coat like armour. His smile was venom. So the rumours were true, he said. The ghost of Ravenfell plays host to runaways. You have no right here, the Duke replied evenly. I have every right, Doncaster sneered. That woman belongs to me. Belongs? Damien's voice dropped to a growl. You speak of her as though she were property. She is. Bought and promised by her own blood. Her uncle signed the contract himself. Ilara appeared then at the top of the stairs, her face pale, but her spine straight. Then her uncle sold nothing worth owning. Doncaster's head snapped up. You dare? I dare everything, she said, descending step by step. Because for the first time in my life I am not afraid. He moved toward her, but Damien stepped between them. The room darkened, thunder cracking overhead. Touch her, the Duke said softly, and I will end you where you stand. The Earl laughed, though uneasily. So the scarred beast bares his teeth. Tell me, Hawthorne, do you intend to fight for every stray you find in the mud? Damien's eyes narrowed. No, only for the ones worth saving. The tension in the hall thickened like smoke. Servants gathered at the edges, whispering prayers. Doncaster's voice dripped contempt. You think this ends here? I'll ruin you both. You, he pointed to Ilara, will crawl back to me before the courts are done. And he, his sneer deepened, will watch his cursed house burn a second time. Before anyone could react, he threw the door open and stormed into the rain. His men followed, their torches vanishing into the storm. When the gates closed, Ilara sank to her knees, her strength finally breaking. The Duke knelt beside her, taking her hand. He can't touch you here, he murmured. Her eyes lifted to his, shimmering. He can't touch my body, perhaps, but he's already poisoned your peace. He shook his head. My peace was ash, long before you came. She smiled faintly through her tears. Then maybe it's time it was reborn in fire. He didn't understand what she meant until later, when the scent of smoke returned to Ravenfell once more. The storm that had escorted the Earl away seemed to leave behind a trail of unease, as if its thunder still echoed through the walls of Ravenfell Keep. Though the house stood unscathed, every candle flicker and every gust of wind through the chimneys carried tension. The servants whispered prayers when they passed the chapel door, and even the Duke's horse refused to graze near the gates, snorting and stamping at the scent of something unseen. Ilara sensed it too, The way the air felt heavier, the way shadows stretched too long after sunset. She had grown used to the rhythm of the keep, the quiet peace she and the Duke had carved in defiance of the world. But now that peace trembled, fragile as the frost on the rose leaves she tended. That evening, she found Damien in the library, standing before the fire as though the flames could speak. His coat was unbuttoned, his hands braced on the mantel. He looked like a man carved from the same stone as his estate, strong, beautiful, but breaking. "You shouldn't be here alone," she said softly. He turned, his eyes catching the firelight. "And you shouldn't worry about me." "How could I not?" she whispered. "He'll come again. I saw it in his eyes." Damien stepped closer, the space between them narrowing. "Let him. If it's war he wants, he'll find one. You think this is about honor?" Her voice trembled, but her gaze held firm. "It's not your name he wants. It's me. He'd destroy you just to hurt me." He stopped a breath away, and for a heartbeat, silence roared louder than thunder. "Then let him try," he said quietly. "I've lived through fire once. I will not lose again." Ilara's hand rose, almost without thought, brushing against the scar that ran from his jaw to his collar. "You survived it," she murmured. "But did you ever escape it?" His breath caught. "No," he admitted. "Until you—" Her eyes widened, and before she could speak, a crash split the night. The sound of breaking glass and shouts from the courtyard. Damien turned sharply, his instincts snapping back into command. "Stay here!" But Ilara followed, heart pounding. Through the front windows they saw the glow first, orange against the mist. Then came the smell. Smoke, thick and sharp. The east wing was burning. "God help us!" cried Mrs. Alden, the cook, running from the hall. "They've set it alight!" Damien's jaw clenched. "Doncaster!" He didn't wait. Grabbing his coat and pistol, he ran into the storm. The rain had lessened, but the fire burned with a hunger that mocked it. Flames crawled up the walls, feeding on the dry wood and tattered drapes. "Ilara!" he shouted over the wind. "Get everyone out!" But she didn't listen. Instead, she ran toward the chapel wing, the forbidden part of the house, the one she'd never dared enter. Something told her that was where the fire had started. Inside, smoke coiled through the air like ghosts. The great portrait of the Duchess hung half-charred, her painted smile dissolving in the heat. And beneath it, an open lantern toppled, the mark of vengeance. "Ilara!" Damien's voice came behind her, hoarse with smoke. He grabbed her arm. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have stayed," she cried, coughing. "The roof's giving way." But he didn't move. His eyes were on the burning portrait. "She died here," he said, voice breaking. "I couldn't save her then." "Then save someone now," she pleaded. The ceiling groaned. He turned just as a beam fell, slamming between them. The impact threw Ilara backward. She hit the ground hard, choking as ash rained down. "Damien!" He pushed through the flames, ignoring the heat clawing at his coat. When he reached her, he wrapped his arms around her, shielding her as another beam fell behind them. His voice was ragged. "Hold on to me." She clung to him, burying her face in his chest. "You'll burn!" "Not before I get you out." They stumbled through the smoke, guided by instinct and desperation. When the doors burst open at last, rain poured over them, hissing against the flames. The servants rushed forward, helping them down the steps. For a moment, they stood in the downpour, coughing, soaked, alive. The east wing was gone, a skeleton of fire and stone, but the rest of the house still stood. Ilara turned to him, trembling. "You could have died." He looked down at her, his face streaked with soot. "So could you." And then, before thought could interfere, he kissed her. It wasn't a chaste or uncertain thing, it was raw, desperate, a vow made in the ruins of the past. When they finally parted, the storm had quieted, as if the heavens themselves held still. In that silence, Damien whispered, "Let him come again, Ilara. Let the whole world come. I'll burn it twice over before I let anyone take you." She pressed her forehead to his, tears mingling with the rain. "Then let's rebuild it together, Your Grace, not from fear, but from fire." And though the flames behind them still licked the night, the first light of dawn began to rise over the cliffs. Dawn came grey and trembling, its light struggling through the thick curtain of smoke that hung over Ravenfell Keep. The fire had been contained by morning, but the east wing was no more than a blackened shell, stone pillars standing like broken ribs against the sky. The servants moved like ghosts through the courtyard, their faces streaked with soot and shock. No one spoke above a whisper, as though sound itself might summon the flames again. Ilara stood among them, her hair damp and tangled, her gown torn at the hem. She had barely slept. The memory of the fire clung to her skin. The heat, the choking air, the sound of beams collapsing like thunder. Yet through it all, one truth burned brighter than any flame. He had come for her. The Duke, the man who had vowed to love nothing again, had carried her through the fire. She turned when she heard his voice. "Have the men finished dousing the embers?" He stood at the edge of the ruins, coat thrown over his shoulders, the wind tugging at his dark hair. His face was bruised and blackened with ash, but his eyes, cold grey and endlessly deep, were clear. "Almost, Your Grace," said the butler. "The west corridor is safe, though the chapel is lost." Damien nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "Let it stay lost," he murmured. Ilara stepped closer. "It doesn't have to be," she said gently. He looked at her then, really looked, as though seeing her not as the runaway noblewoman or the unwanted guest, but as something far more difficult to name. "You should rest," he said after a long silence. "You inhaled enough smoke to kill a lesser soul." "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see fire." He gave a faint, rueful smile. "Welcome to Ravenfell." They stood together in the ruins, the air cold enough to make their breath visible. Around them, the servants worked quietly, rebuilding what they could. Ilara followed Damien's gaze toward the chapel remains, the place where his past had burned once, and now again. "She died there," she said softly. "Your wife." He didn't flinch. "Yes. And you've kept her ghost alive ever since." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You think me a fool for it?" "I think you've mistaken guilt for love," she replied. "You loved her once, but you've punished yourself for surviving her ever since." Her words struck like a blade wrapped in silk. He turned away, his breath sharp. "You know nothing of what happened that night." "Then tell me." He was silent for a long time. The sea wind howled across the cliffs, filling the spaces his voice refused to. Then finally he spoke, his tone low, cracked with old pain. "There was a storm like last night's. She wanted to ride to the chapel to bless our wedding rings before we were to marry. I told her it could wait. She laughed. She always laughed when she thought me too cautious, and went alone. The lantern overturned. By the time I reached her, the fire had already taken everything." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they gleamed wetly in the grey light. "I heard her screaming my name, Ilara. I can still hear it." Ilara stepped forward, her voice a whisper. "You couldn't have saved her." He looked at her sharply. You don't know that. I do, she said, because last night you did save someone, and it wasn't because you owed it. It was because your heart still knows how. The wind stilled. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink until there was only the two of them, standing among the ashes of grief and rebirth. Damien reached out then, almost hesitantly, his fingers brushing her wrist. You are the most reckless woman I've ever known. And you, she said softly, are the bravest man I've ever met. He let out a quiet laugh, the sound startling even to himself. No one's called me that in years. She met his eyes. Then perhaps it's time someone did. They stood in silence again, not needing words. The air between them hummed with something fragile but fierce, an understanding forged in smoke and sorrow. At last, Damien spoke. If you stay here, Elara, it will not be easy. Doncaster will not stop. The world beyond these walls will call you his runaway bride, and me your ruin. I've been a prisoner my entire life, she said, her voice steady. If freedom means standing beside you, even in ruin, then I'll take it. His expression broke, just slightly, the ice in his gaze thawing. You don't know what you're promising. Ah, yes, I do. And then with quiet certainty she added, You saved my life. Let me save yours. For the first time, Damien did not have an answer. He only looked at her. At the courage in her eyes, the defiance in her posture, the warmth that seemed to chase away the chill of the ruins, and realized that somewhere between the fire and the dawn he had fallen in love, but love, he knew, would demand a price. He turned to the horizon where smoke met sea. Then so be it, he said quietly. Let the world come for us. This time we'll face it together. The wind shifted that night, sharp, metallic, carrying the scent of iron and rain. It was a warning. Even before the first horn sounded at the gate, Duke Damien Hawthorne knew the world had come for them. He stood in his study, coat half-buttoned, pistol on the desk beside an unfinished letter. The ink was still wet when the butler burst through the door. Your Grace, riders, at least 20. They bear the Earl's banner. Damien closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. So it begins. Wake the men, he said calmly. Bolt the inner gates. No one opens them without my word. The butler hesitated. He carries papers, Your Grace, a warrant signed by Parliament. Damien's jaw tightened. Then let him read it through the rain. Outside, thunder rolled like cannon fire. Torches bobbed through the fog, casting ghostly halos of light. The Earl of Doncaster rode at their head, his pale hair plastered to his skull, his smile that of a man who'd already written his enemy's epitaph. Hawthorne! His voice rang through the storm. By law and honour, I demand the return of my betrothed, Lady Elara Whitmore. From the grand staircase above, Elara watched unseen, her heart hammering. Her hand tightened around the rail until her knuckles whitened. She'd known this moment would come, but not so soon. Not like this. The Duke stepped into the courtyard, rain slicing across his face, his dark coat whipping like a banner. She's no longer yours to demand, he said evenly. Doncaster's laughter was sharp as broken glass. You think yourself her saviour when you're merely her ruin. She's bound to me by contract, signed and sealed. You, Hawthorne, are nothing but a thief of property and name. I've stolen nothing, Damien said. You forfeited your claim when you treated her like a possession. Doncaster's horse pawed the ground. You forget yourself. The law is clear, and I have it in writing. Stand aside, and perhaps they'll show mercy when they burn this haunted ruin to ash. At that, Damien's calm cracked. He took a step forward, voice low and thunderous. "You burned it once already. Try again, and you'll find I've no mercy left to lose." The tension between them was knife-sharp, electric. The soldiers behind Doncaster shifted uneasily, uncertain if they were about to witness a trial or a duel. Then a voice cut through the storm. "Enough!" Ilara stepped out from the shadows, cloak thrown over her shoulders, hair unbound and glimmering with rain. She moved down the steps slowly, every eye turning toward her. "I will not let men decide what my freedom is worth," she said, her voice carrying through the wind. "You speak of contracts, my lord, but none of your ink binds my soul." Doncaster's face twisted. "You ungrateful wretch, I bought you from ruin, clothed you, fed you." "You chained me," she interrupted, "and when I fled you hunted me like game, but I have found something you'll never understand." He sneered. "Love? With this scarred beast?" Ilara smiled faintly, though her eyes were fierce. "Yes, with the only man who ever saw me as human." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, servants, guards, and soldiers alike. Even the rain seemed to still. Doncaster's composure cracked. "Then you choose your shame." He turned to his men. "Caesar!" But before they could move, Damien drew his pistol, levelling it squarely at the Earl's chest. "The next man who touches her dies." Gasps rippled through the courtyard. For a moment, no one moved. Even Doncaster froze, his arrogance faltering under the Duke's calm fury. "This is treason," he spat. "This is justice," Damien said, "and if you believe the law will save you from it, you're a fool." The two men faced each other like reflections of different worlds. One built on cruelty, the other on redemption. Lightning flashed between them, carving their silhouettes into the rain. Then, unexpectedly, Ilara stepped between them. She placed a hand on Damien's arm, lowering the gun. "No," she whispered, "he's not worth the blood." Her gaze met Doncaster's, steady and unflinching. "You wanted to own me, to cage me, but look at me now, standing where you can't touch me, loved in ways you'll never earn. Go, my lord, take your papers and your threats and leave. The woman you wanted no longer exists." For a heartbeat, Doncaster said nothing. His face twisted through fury, disbelief, and something close to fear. Then he wheeled his horse around sharply. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Not as much as you will," Damien replied. With a final glare, the Earl spurred his horse and vanished into the storm. His men hesitated, then followed. When silence returned, it came like a benediction. Ilara turned to the Duke, her breath catching. "It's over," she whispered. He shook his head slightly. "No, it's only beginning." The pistol dropped from his hand, clattering onto the stones. Then he drew her into his arms, his voice rough against her ear. "You've given me something the fire never could take." She smiled against his chest. "And what's that?" "Reason to live again." Above them, dawn broke fully, spilling gold over the sea. The smoke rising from the east wing curled toward the light like incense, a requiem for the ghosts of the past. And for the first time, Ravenfell Keep no longer felt haunted. The days after Doncaster's departure passed like slow breaths of spring after a long and merciless winter. The storm that had ravaged the coast had left Ravenfell battered but standing, its scorched stones darkened by rain, its halls hushed but not hollow. For the first time in years, the manor smelled not of ash and grief, but of fresh bread, candle wax, and roses newly planted in the courtyard. Ilara rose early each morning, her skirts brushing the dew-laced grass, as she tended the garden that had once belonged to the Duchess. Her hands, still rough from work, coaxed life from the soil with a tenderness born of survival. Each rose bush she revived, seemed to draw the Duke nearer. Sometimes she felt his gaze upon her before she even heard his step. On the 5th morning, she found him there waiting by the fountain, dressed in a dark coat, his hair unbound, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. The mist of dawn clung to him like memory, and for a moment Elara thought he looked less like a lord and more like a man unburdened. "You've been avoiding the chapel ruins," she said gently, setting down her basket. "I have no ghosts left to chase," he answered. "Only the living." She smiled faintly. "Then the living will keep you busy." He stepped closer. "Perhaps that's what I need." For a heartbeat, they said nothing. The world around them seemed to hush. The sea below whispered against the cliffs, and the air trembled with the scent of wet earth and salt. "Elara," he said at last, his voice low, "I've spent half my life punishing myself for what was lost. And when you came here, I thought you were a reminder of that same curse. But you've shown me that the heart doesn't die, it merely hides." She looked up at him, eyes luminous in the pale light. "And what will you do with it now that you've found it again?" He hesitated, then smiled, a real smile, small and trembling, but alive. "Offer it to the only woman who's ever dared to challenge me." Her breath caught, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. "You don't mean—" "I do." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, its fabric worn from years of neglect. Inside, nestled in dust and memory, lay a ring, the one his late fiancée had never worn. "I had this made once, for a promise I couldn't keep," he said softly. "But I've learned that love born from guilt isn't love at all. I would rather give it new meaning with you." Elara's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the simple gold band. "Damien!" He dropped to one knee, not the proud Duke of Ravenfell now, but the man who had stood with her in fire, who had faced ruin for her name. "I won't ask for vows or titles. Only this: stay. Build this place with me. Let the walls that burned be the ones we raise again together." She knelt before him, her tears falling freely, mingling with his. "I ran from a monster and found a man who taught me what freedom feels like," she whispered. "How could I ever leave?" He smiled then and slipped the ring onto her hand. The band fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her all along. At that moment, the sun broke fully over the cliffs, flooding the courtyard with gold. The light struck the fountain, the roses, the ruined chapel beyond, and for the first time in memory, Ravenfell glowed. From the balcony above, the servants watched, some weeping quietly, others smiling as though waking from a long dream. Mrs. Alden whispered, "The curse is broken." That evening, the manor came alive with sound, the crackle of the hearths, the laughter of the staff, the faint hum of music drifting through the corridors. The piano that had gathered dust for years sang again beneath Elara's hands. Damien stood by the window, watching her, the firelight gilding the scar on his jaw, until it looked like a mark of grace, not pain. When the last note faded, she turned to him. "You said you despised music once." He walked to her slowly. "I was wrong. It wasn't music I despised. It was memory. But you've turned even that into something I can bear." She rose and he reached for her hand. "Then let's make new memories," she said, softly. He pulled her close, his voice a whisper against her temple. "For the first time I am not haunted. I am home." And as night settled over Ravenfell, the waves below whispered their endless hymn, and the old house finally slept in peace. Its halls no longer mourning, its master no longer alone, its walls echoing not with ghosts, but with the sound of two hearts learning to live again.